Who start?
Yep, go on.
Okay,
Sure.
comrades, you're all very welcome to this meeting of Workers' International Network. The network it involves comrades from a range of countries representing working class movements across the globe. Now, a couple of words in Irish. Accordia. Tá fáilte roimh go léir chun an cruinniú tábhachtach seo. Tá scoil agam go mbeidh díospóireach sa múla going gan áras beg. Now, we're fortunate today to have as our principal speaker Clare Daly, who was a really significant figure in the European Parliament as an MEP up to the most recent elections, where unfortunately, and against the expectations of comrades, she lost her seat through a combination of factors, including consistent attacks in the media and also a failure of the left to unite around a left-wing candidate. Clare herself, and we also want to welcome Joan Collins, a TD in the Irish Parliament, and Dermot Connolly, all of whom are from the Independence for Change group. Clare has been in consistent opposition to the right in the European Parliament on a range of issues: unemployment rights, workers' rights, health, and issues of that nature, plus international issues such as Palestine. And in particular, Clare has taken a lot of initiatives in fighting against the incursions of NATO and the involvement of European countries in the NATO alliance. Unfortunately, at the present time, following the elections, there's a majority of the right in the European Parliament under the European People's Party, and a coalition, unfortunately, between the Christian Democratic right and the what are called socialists and Democrats. But we need to remind ourselves before we embark on this discussion that it's not just the traditional right that's threatening us now. There's a range of far-right groups in several countries across Europe. In Italy, we have Meloni. In Germany, Alternative for Deutschland. In France, the Rassemblement Français. In Belgium, Vlaams Belang Party. In Netherlands, Wilders with the PVV. In Poland, the Law and Justice Party. In Hungary, Fidesz. In Finland, another far-right government. In Austria, the Freedom Party. And in the UK, huge dangers facing us, not because Labour has won the election, that's got a different set of problems, but the rise of the Reform Party under Farage. And The Economist recently said that had there been a proportionate system in Britain, Farage's party Reform would have 94 seats in Parliament. Now, the PR system in Ireland is a very quirky and very complicated system, but nonetheless, if they were to operate in Britain, we'd have 94 Reform Party members. There's a new group forming also in the European Parliament called the Patriots for Europe, with the right wing coming together. In addition to these figures which I've given, the Slovakian Prime Minister was recently shot, Fico, by some right-wing thug. A Social Democrat MP was beaten up in Eastern Germany. Green Party members were also attacked in Eastern Germany. And the far right has emerged in countries where there's serious issues with inflation, living standards, and so on. Then there's a number of countries where the right are actually in power, in alliance with the traditional right-wing parties. That's happening in the Netherlands, in Austria, in France, in Finland, in Croatia, Sweden, Denmark, and quite a range of places. One of the issues that Clare has taken up significantly and consistently has been the issue of armaments and the involvement of European countries, all of whom, by the way, are ex-colonial. The number of ex-colonial countries in the European Union is quite sizable. You'll know most of them: Germany, France, Portugal, Spain, Italy, quite a range. And the spending on arms is not just limited to the United States. I saw a recent figure that in the past year, NATO has spent $1.3 trillion on armaments in 1 year. And that's not all from the United States, by the way. There's significant arms industries in Britain. There's Rheinmetall in Germany. There's the Thales industry in France. Arms are also being exported from Denmark, from Netherlands, and other places. So Clare has taken up this question of armaments and NATO in particular consistently in her meetings across Europe. Before we embark on the discussion, we need to remind ourselves that the European Union reflects the governments and the political movements in the individual countries. It's not some abstract entity that comes out of nowhere. It reflects the needs and the priorities of the European countries. By the way, it's not that long ago, maybe 20 years ago, when there were 15 countries in the European Union, 11 of them had social democratic governments. Not the case now. Now, in many countries, social democrats are gone. They've been defeated and wiped off the map. That's not something we celebrate. That's a consequence of programs of austerity and attacks on living standards and privatization of companies. Now, I've no doubt we're going to have a very interesting discussion on the issues, and there'll be an open and frank exchange of ideas. Comrades can say as they wish, and we can debate ideas to come back and forth as we wish. The structure of the meeting is going to be as follows. First of all, Clare will speak. That'll be followed then by an open session of questions and answers and continuing discussion of the issues. As the discussion develops, we'll then go into part 2 of our meeting, when Dermot and Joan can make their interventions and further discussion can take place then at that point. So once again, I want to thank Clare for coming. We're fortunate to have somebody of her stature at a meeting of this nature. And as I say, when Clare finishes her opening contribution, there'll be plenty of time to raise issues and to debate issues of Comrade's own choosing. So, Clare, away you go.
Thanks very much, Finn. I hope people can hear me, and thanks very much for the initiative and for inviting me along, although a Sunday afternoon of the All-Ireland hurling final, but still we'll let you away with that. Luckily, I'm not a hurling fan. But look, I have to leave in about an hour, if that's okay, if I push it to about 5:15. But look, it's an honour for me to be here, and thanks for convening. I kind of, listening to Finn's introduction, we'd be here forever dealing with that. So I kind of jotted down a few notes in relation to the points Roger had put together in putting out the invite for the meeting. So basically the idea of the sort of retreat of the left, the rise of the far right, but very much in the context of the recent European Parliament elections. And I suppose the first thing to say about them is that while they were European elections, it wasn't one election, it's 27 elections, because even though the European Union might like to tell you, and Ursula von der Leyen presents herself as a sort of a leader of the United States of Europe, we know that that is not so, and local factors predominate in very many of them. I think what we do see as a trend, though, across all of them is very much the Americanization of European politics, the growth and the disconnect between the ordinary citizens and those in power. And what we've seen is the European elites and the bureaucracy at the centre of Brussels using the treaties, the Nice Treaty, the Lisbon Treaty, where they quietly gathered more and more power into the unelected centre, beginning now to take flesh and to be used very much so. And the consequence of that is to even deepen the disconnect further. People feel quite alienated. You would have seen in the turnout in the recent elections wasn't really 50%, but from 20% in Croatia. Most of the Eastern European countries failed to get anywhere near 40%. Hungary actually being the exception at 60%. But generally speaking, low turnout, not much faith in it, but obviously the results reflecting the national factors in a number of member states, as outlined by Finn, the sort of growth of the far right in countries like Germany and so on. We see that as well in even Portugal, in other countries like that. So I suppose the first thing to say is in my own case, just to get that out of the way, I mean, it wasn't really against all expectation. It would have been incredibly difficult had I held on to that seat. It was very clear a number of years ago, particularly around the war in Ukraine, that, and even before that, to be honest, but a section of the establishment in Ireland and their mouthpieces in the media saw the opportunity around the war in Ukraine to silence that Euro-critical voice, which Ireland and Dublin in particular had always returned through people like Patricia McKenna, Joe Higgins, whatever. There was always that sort of dissenting left voice there. And the plan to eliminate that had been really underway for years. I think the media onslaught against myself and Mick Wallace will be the subject of doctorates and PhDs, and we're trying to see can it be the subject of sort of litigation, because it was substantially sustained, unbroken assault over years, castigating us as pro-Russian, pro-Putin. The story was put out that we'd basically gone to Europe and gone mad. And surprisingly or unsurprisingly in some ways, that did take hold a bit. We all know that truth is the first casualty of war. We know that this offensive against anybody who speaks for peace in Ukraine, who stands up to the militarization of Europe, is bizarrely castigated as someone who's against Ukraine and pro-war in some ways, pro-appeasement. But that really, I don't think that would have been enough in Ireland to stop me getting the seat, to be honest, because while it came up in the election every day in this new climate of hostility, where violence and aggression prevails everywhere in political discourse, that's crept in Ireland too. So the campaign would have been quite difficult in that every day we would have met middle-class, middle-aged men who felt it their duty to very loudly proclaim that we were Kremlin stooges, Putin's whore, go back to Russia, you Russian bitch, etc., in a manner in which I would never have experienced as 25 years of an elected politician and 40 years as an activist. That type of sort of targeted aggressive abuse I never got before. But also every day we got people who thanked us for our position, not just on Palestine or for speaking out, but actually on Ukraine as well. Now, they did a lot more quietly, and but thanks very much for your position on Ukraine. But it just shows the power of the media and the power of the political establishment. And I think that is one of the things that's actually added to the rise of the far right, because traditional political discourse as we know it is kind of no more. I mean, if you compare the war in Iraq, and obviously we know truth was the first casualty there, it was started with lies, but you could still have and put forward an anti-war position and have it been engaged with on its merits. In terms of the militarization of Europe and the war in Ukraine, you can't have that. You're either with us or against us. And if you talk for peace, you just want to appease Russia, you're just a stooge and that kind of thing. We didn't have that before. And if you think back to COVID, which to me, I think a lot of the problems and a lot of the impetus for the rise of the far right has come from COVID. And Naomi Klein has written an interesting book on this. And I actually kind of agree with some of the points that she makes, that in COVID and in the lockdown and the state assuming more powers, traditionally it's the left who are anti-state and who, argue for less power for the police and all this kind of stuff. But it seemed like the left went on board and argued for more empowerment of the state, and that all of those disenfranchised people who felt they hadn't got a voice felt that they were left with nobody. And we kind of see now political discourse is down to clickbait stuff. You're either for us, against us. If you raise questions about how a government handles COVID, you're an anti-vaxxer. If you give out about the war in Ukraine, you're a Putin puppet. If you argue for Palestine, you're an anti-Zionist. And if you give out about the Irish government or other people's policies on migration, you're a racist or you're far right. And I think this has helped to sort of alienate people and feel they're not being listened to, because they aren't being listened to. As simple as that. We know that that is the case. So I think that that hostile backdrop has driven a lot of people into the arms of the far right because of that, but crucially because of the abandonment of left-wing forces in working class communities. I mean, the UN Special Rapporteur for Housing during the election made the point that the reason why we have the far right is very simple. It's the crisis in housing across Europe. And I agree with that. And I think it's very much the case in Ireland. In Ireland now, we have a far right and a violent far right engaging in working class communities and feeding off the betrayal and the sort of, I won't call it wokeness, but the smugness and the self-righteousness of a lot of the social democratic left, but also by the likes of people before profit and that as well, being on their kind of high horse about racism and these issues and talking down to working class communities and so on. I mean, Ireland absorbed over 100,000 people when the EU enlarged. We had a spike in ordinary migration then, roughly similar problems as numbers as now, and there was never a problem with migration. The only reason there's a problem now is there's no houses for them and they're not allowed to work. And the media have elevated this into a crisis beyond what ordinary people. So it's a deliberate strategy by the establishment to distract attention from corporate mishandling and profiteering from the economy. I know I deviated from my own position. What I should have said was I don't think the media onslaught was enough, would have been enough. I think we would have held the seat had it not been for the decision of People Before Profit to decide that they wanted to take my seat. We had a discussion with them beforehand. We warned them that they wouldn't take me out. I think they probably thought that the media had done such a good job on damaging my reputation that I'd be damaged goods. They maybe arrogantly thought they could take the seat. That was never going to happen. They were never going to get more than me. We told them that. We said they couldn't win the seat, but that they could stop me from winning it. And that is, in effect, what happened by standing a high-profile member of the Irish Parliament against me, who in some ways, when you're away in Europe, you're less in the media. It's kind of harder to defend your position because your job is away and the media don't cover any of the work that you actually do. But Breed Smith for People Before Profit would have been a well-known Irish politician in the news. The newspapers elevated her around the election, and they also elevated my far-right independent contender. Well, far-right is maybe a slight exaggeration, but someone who certainly plays to that, who's a very strong independent right-wing person as well. And both of those ate into my vote, and we missed out on that. But to me, we would have hung on. We would have had enough first preferences to be ahead of the packed field had Breed Smith not stood. But I think across Europe, the situation is bleak. It's very bleak in the European Parliament now. A lot of the forces, the left group, when we were in it, was never great anyway. Quite frankly, you had the old communist left, which tried to stand the ground, but a lot of that sort of La France Insoumise, Die Linke in Germany, Podemos, a lot of these had very much moved to the right, very cautious positions. And now, since the election, we see the situation being even worse, where the policy and the principles of the new group now is that you must obviously forthright condemnation of the war in Ukraine and condemnation of Russia, but no similar condemnation of Israel, which is quite astounding. And in terms of Irish representation there, we see Sinn Féin, Joan and Dermot can deal with that later, but Sinn Féin have two people in the Parliament, but as an indication of the way they are going to behave going forward, they voted for a resolution on Ukraine the other day, which voted to ensure and support NATO's commitment to Ukraine, to say that Ukraine was on an unstoppable course to NATO membership, and calling for all countries collectively and individually to contribute 0.25% of their GDP to military aid for Ukraine, which in an Irish context would be greater than our entire defence budget. But Sinn Féin actually voted for that motion in the European Parliament the other day. So what we can see is they very much decided to keep the head down. They saw what was done to us, and they don't want to go there. They're going to play it safe. I suppose an interesting aside is that a lot of these left parties around Europe, even though their leadership in the Parliament would have been quite conservative, in every European country, and I probably spoke in every European country, there were members of those parties who were enormous fans of the work of myself and Mick Wallace, who disagreed with the party leadership, who wanted an alternative, really striking at meetings in the likes of Sweden and Finland, where the left is in, or the establishment left, even the left in the left group are terrible. And they're on the other side of the social democracy, but hundreds of people at meeting, supporting anti-militarization, pro-peace, and so on. So what we have is, in my opinion, a very, very gigantic gap now between those in power who've been captured by corporate lobbyists who are subsuming the interests of the European Union into that of the US, the military industrial complex, big pharma, big agri, they rule the roost. They are the ones to whom the unelected commission answer. And we have this buffer with national governments, which unfortunately, like the Irish one, are kind of feeding into that handing away of national sovereignty to that unelected Brussels elite who've gone beyond a lot of their powers. But it's that's feeding the alienation from more and more people in Europe from, I suppose, the European project itself, and feeding the ground to hostility towards migration and so on. I haven't even touched on any of the environmental issues. That's a very brushstroke sort of ladybird tour of the European Parliament as it is in now. Ironically, the left group is bigger than it was, but politically the platform is weaker than it has been. There had been attempts to form another left group or an anti-militarist group headed by the Sarah Wagenknecht group, along with some of the Five Stars in Italy and some other forces again. Fico's crowd may or may not have joined that. They couldn't pull it together, but the far right were able to pull together there. So the usual disunity on the left is not helping them. So maybe I'll leave it at that because I'm not even sure that they were the things I was supposed to deal with. So I leave them as an introduction, but I'm prepared to answer any questions on things I didn't deal with or anything at all, actually.
Thanks very much, Clare, for that opening contribution. No, there was no set of ideas that you had to stick to. You could say anything you wish on what issues you chose. And then comrades are free to bring up issues as they want to further the discussion in any specific direction. Then you can deal with the issues as they arise. Probably the best way to deal with it is to take a few comrades first to speak, and then you can take up these points rather than take them off one by one, or rather than let them all pile up till the end. So we'll take the comrades now who want to make contributions. Steve, I see you've indicated there, followed by Ian.
It's just a question. I mean, obviously we're plagued by sectarianism in Britain as well, and I just want to get it clarified, Clare, because I'm absolutely distraught that you got deselected or you got voted out, because I thought you were a fantastic voice on Palestine in particular. Can you just clarify what points of difference there were between People and People Before Profit and the program that you were putting forward? Or, you know, or what was their justification for standing against you? Because I'm not clear on what it was at all.
Ian, go ahead. Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, thanks. I agree. You're a fantastic voice on Palestine and on Ukraine. I think on the latter, especially, we've got less of that, and you'll be particularly missed. And it's worrying to hear even about forces like Francis Samis and stuff moving to a more middle of the road position on that as it becomes increasingly untenable for the establishment, you'd have thought. So couple of questions on the same electoral system with a smaller constituency. Presumably it would be easier to get into the Dáil, and I hope that you do. Secondly, in terms of the rise of the far right in the EU elections specifically, do you think it's something about EU elections themselves that helps the far right? The fact that this is a non-sovereign parliament twice over, that it's this multinational, not even confederation, really, but can be portrayed as a super state by nationalist forces. And it's not sovereign over the workings of the EU. It's more of a talking shop. It's theoretically an excellent place for protest votes, and sometimes pirate parties and random forces have been able to take advantage of that. But the main protest, the most extreme example is probably Britain, where we kept having parties that wanted us to leave the EU top the poll, and eventually we did leave the EU. But certainly nationalist parties with grievance against the thing itself, as opposed to more general referenda on the state of play in the country at the time, that might be more helpful to the left. And for example, in France, the far right topped that poll. Macron tried to throw the election to them, coming out of that, and instead his party came second by default, only because the far right came third, which nobody expected when the left did get their act together. And finally, in terms of the right-wing result in Ireland, the conventionality of Sinn Féin, I don't know if you were ever colleagues at the same time, but when they ran one of their MEPs for president a few years ago, they got a very poor result, but going forward from that, they then did get their historic best result yet for the Dáil. I wonder if the same thing can be repeated, that they underperformed at this election, but going into the next one, where it's the Dáil and it's about Irish unity with what's going on up north, if they'll do better again, because everyone was saying they were on course to be the largest party, perhaps up to the same amount as the two parties of government together. And what I thought was particularly alarming wasn't just the far right, but the centre right holding in the Irish EU Parliament elections, where Sinn Féin got about 10%. Both of the traditional parties, coalition partners in government, in a very unpopular government that needs the Greens to prop it up, each got 20%. So altogether, they got 4 times the Sinn Féin vote, which I didn't expect either as a far right protest vote. It's just not a protest vote. It's a vote for the status quo. So if you could possibly explain that, was it people trying to keep the far right out? Is there a reserve for these groups that people on the left and the outside side of politics more generally needs to take more into account? Or is it again just the general reactionary nature of a European parliamentary election? Thanks.
Thank you, Ian. We'll take one more contribution, then you can come back, Claire. Harris Shakeris, have I got your pronunciation correct? Your name pronounced correctly? Okay.
Yeah, thanks. I'm wondering, so here's a question. Can Europe, and does Europe want to get independent from the US? And also to make it more difficult, without militarizing itself and trying to, without militarizing itself. So can it get independent from the US? And does it want to get independent from the US? And can it do that whilst choosing its own friends and, in a peaceful manner, without becoming a bloc and without without attaching itself to the other major power, which seems to be China? I don't know if Russia wants to huddle with Europe or has its own agenda, like imperialist agenda or whatever, like under the current, or either imperialist or not to be surrounded by NATO, you take your pick. So that's my question. Thanks.
Thank you, Harris. So if you take up these points, Claire, and then we'll come back to the discussion again after them.
Well, far-ranging, but I'll try and deal with them all and try and not go on too long with any of them. I think first, in terms of the first question and the programmatic difference between my platform and People Before Profits, well, actually none really. Their excuse was that I was not building anything. They're building a party. To which we obviously said we were building a movement and we were a platform and a voice across Europe and indeed the world. And I should have made that point because it links into the second question, which was about the European Parliament itself. And of course, it doesn't really have power to initiate legislation or anything like that. It has a blocking power, but it's not a normal parliament or a normal instrument, a democratic check in that sense. But what it was for us was an incredible platform, because bizarrely outside Europe, people think if you're a member of the European Parliament that you carry far more weight and influence than you do if you were in a national parliament and so on. And I literally went to every continent. I had a Fine Gael member who was down at an interparliamentary meeting in Rwanda who texted me to say, I've been at an official meeting in Rwanda and the people at it want to know, do I know you? Because they follow your speeches on social media and so on. We were in Pakistan. People came running across an airport to say, are you the two Irish guys from the European Parliament? And this was even before our stance and position on Palestine. I suppose, got an even greater audience. That was simply for arguing for the international law against militarization and for a position in terms of the war in Russia. But just on people before profit, like there was none. Like what they said to us was that, officially, but obviously it was never true, that, well, yeah, there were 2 seats there. But we said, well, Sinn Féin are going to take a seat, and they were talking about Niall Boylan, this very strong independent right-wing candidate. There's only 4 seats, so that was just never true. My own belief is that they thought that I was maybe weakened by the media attack, and they maybe arrogantly thought that they could take me on first preferences and benefit from transfers from me. But the official line, there was no programmatic differences. Officially, they said, yeah, there was 2 seats, and they were entitled to run, even though they lost that voice for everywhere. And I know it was acutely felt in Palestine this week. We've had messages all over the world from people getting in touch on that. In terms of standing for the Dáil and the different parliamentary systems, way too early to say that. We haven't made up our minds about what to do going forward, whether I would or should challenge to try and go back to the Dáil. I certainly wouldn't stand in my own area because I have a young representative there now who filled the gap, has carried on the mantle, topped the poll in the local elections, and I'm certainly not going bullying my way back in there. But we'll see what will happen there. The points about the far right being helped by the nature of the institution, I think, are very interesting. There's no doubt about it. The undemocratic nature, the manner in which sort of even COVID was handled, and the corporate capture by big pharma and so on resonated in a lot. A huge issue was the European Union's handling of the war in Ukraine, particularly in Germany, whereby Europe pauperized itself, did contribute to its own deindustrialization by cutting off the link of cheap energy with Russia, paying 4 times the amount that the Americans do for LNG. And with the result that business then is leaving Europe, going in search of cheaper energy, either to China or to the US. Absolute catastrophe in terms of business interests in Europe, not to mind the living standards of ordinary people and the devastating cost of living crisis. So people can see how there's vested interest profiting from that, and ordinary people are paying for that. And I do think that the massive influx of millions of people from Ukraine as well has added to sort of and fed into that migration story, even though it's the different colour migrants, the ordinary migrants and asylum seekers who get targeted, but the numbers of Ukrainians who came in had a destabilizing element there. But I think that contributed, but I think that gap between the citizens and those in power is kind of growing everywhere anyway. It's particularly acute in Eastern Europe. I mean, for me, and everybody knows that when the countries in Eastern Europe joined, it resulted in their brightest and best moving west as a pool of cheap labour for the old colonial European powers, and they joined NATO. They were the 2 reasons, and their elites, and they're both right and left in some ways in those Eastern European economies, took the European money. Some of them invested, some of it a lot of them put it into their own pockets. So rampant corruption on a scale not quite of what you'd see in the likes of Ukraine and that, but certainly not that far away from it still exists. So that big gap, and the numbers not voting is huge in these societies. It's a bit like following what's happening in America. And I think it was a little bit like that in Ireland. The people not voting are the important ones. We had a 50% turnout. The right-wing parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, got their vote out. Sinn Féin didn't. I mean, there was a lot of media play, and certainly Sinn Féin expected to do a hell of a lot better than they actually did. But they did make some gains, very, very small and way less than they wanted. But I mean, the Greens suffered badly, but nobody talked that up and said, oh, the Greens were annihilated. So some of it is a media focus, and obviously Sinn Féin are worried. I would very much expect them to do better in the general election, but there's a lot of media talk about a crisis. And that's actually, and I think this happens a lot, that's forcing Sinn Féin incorrectly. It's not forcing them, but they're responding to them by moving more into the centre. And that's alienating their working class base more. And that's playing more into the hands of what we loosely call the far right. And I mean, for me, I'm sure Joan and Dermot will deal with it later, and they'd be more on the ground than me in terms of Sinn Féin, but also in terms of what we call the far right. And I'm very reticent to call a lot of the movements in Ireland or those organisations of abandoned rural and working class communities far right. They've certainly been left abandoned and are being preyed upon by the far right. But a hell of a lot of these people are people who are around us and around the left in the anti-water charges movement. There's always mad people who, you know, love conspiracy theories and go down a bit of rabbit holes. But in that movement, the madness was contained because it was part of a bigger progressive struggle. Now, in the absence of that, a lot of that madness is taking hold, and some people who have legitimate gripes about, be it, you know, whatever it is, there is huge problems with the way in which the Irish government is handling migration. And the problem is when anybody says that, they're immediately shut down and called far right or a racist. And they are not that. Some of them are prey to that and may become that, but they are not necessarily that. And I think a lot of the people who, you know, stood on a far right ticket, who did get okay votes, some of the people who ended up voting for them did it out of stubbornness and out of being alienated by the media and by political groups on the left talking down to them and calling them names and not dealing actually with the substance of the issues that's driving them mad, which is a hugely problem. There is a problematic migration system, but the real root of it is the housing crisis. And Sinn Féin in the last week have responded by not just focusing even on that again. Now they're looking and giving credence to the idea of migration and migrants being the problem by talking about increasing the number of safe countries that people can be returned to. I mean, Christ almighty, that is absolutely pathetic, rather than concentrating on the corporate interests at the helm. So I do think people not voting, and Sinn Féin have a lot of work to do to get their vote out. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael got theirs out. It wasn't there was a big move in favour of them, and there isn't going to be, but it'll be people staying at home if the others don't enthuse them. And the last question was about Europe being independent. The last commission, and under a democratic administration, or a Democrat, not democratic at all, but under the Democrats, Europe tends to be more, you know, cozy with the US. There's been only problems in Europe's relationship with the US when Trump gets re-elected, and I'm assuming that he most definitely will get re-elected. Now that would be a shock. My one wasn't, but his one definitely will be. But a Trump re-election will push Europe more in that direction of coming out of the wing of the US. But in the last administration, they have subsumed all their own interests and taken positions on the war in Ukraine, on the issue of Israel and so on, in response to America's interest and NATO's interest, not Europe's interest. And now we have NATO dominating the EU, the defence industry dominating the EU, calling the shots. So that idea of getting independence, they could have gone down that road, but certainly at the moment they aren't.
Thank you, Clare. I just want to comment on one of the points you made from the point of view of the discussion. It might be necessary to clarify this issue. There's huge alienation in our society. It's not just in housing. People who are renting accommodation could be spending €2,000 a month. A house in Dublin now, a small two-bedroom house, is going to cost you €400,000, which is beyond the reach of people. You can't get medical appointments for specialists for a year, within 12 months. You can't see a doctor anymore. The best you're going to get is a phone call. Medical, dental services, child psychology services, disability services, they're all in crisis. They can't find teachers. And what's happening is there are then right-wing parties, the Irish National Party, the Irish Freedom Party, who exploit that alienation and pretend and put forward the idea that the reason all this is happening is because of the presence of asylum seekers and migrants in the country. So that lie is the way in which they deal with the alienation in working class communities. So the vote is not a right-wing vote. Not all the people who support these people are fascists or anything like that. They're being deluded into thinking that the problems are being caused by the immigration crisis and not by the government and by government policy. And that needs to be combated. And as Clare pointed out, the left has a responsibility to put forward a programme that can solve these problems in housing and health and education and so on, and not allow the right wing to get a foothold. But there are genuine right wing parties exploiting it, the Irish Freedom Party, the Irish National Party, some of them on the fringes of fascism, who are exploiting this alienation across society. But it's happening in Europe. It's not just in Ireland, it's happening right across Europe. It's an important point to bring out. Now, I just mentioned if Clare or if Joan or Dermot was to come in at this point, they can. But I said originally we'd let this discussion run out, and then we'd ask Joan and Dermot to come in. But you might want to participate in this discussion as well. So we first had Steve indicating. So if anybody else wants to speak, can they just indicate now? So Steve.
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank you, Clare, for participating. I think it's important for American workers that they hear an anti-imperialist voice and anti-imperialist voices in Europe. And obviously, there are a lot of Americans who are watching your video as well and your statements. So they're supporting the United States for your views. I think that, the imperialism and the danger of imperialist war is growing. I mean, that's historically how capitalism has solved their crisis, by going to war, imperialist countries and rivalries. I wonder what you think about the issue of fascism, because a fascist government in the United States would actually fundamentally change all the relationships internationally. And the intervention of the United States in Latin America and many countries would be imperialist policies on steroids, in my view, overturning governments and a much more aggressive policy where they have power and the ability in the military. So where do you, what's your view about fighting fascism and the potential of a united front, a global united front against fascism, which I think is absolutely critical for the working class to unite internationally, and the labor movement particularly. The situation in the United States is that most workers, the union bureaucracy, don't even want to have a discussion on fascism. Their solution is to vote for Biden. That's going to save them. So the question is, what should workers do to organize against fascism and confront it, and how that should take place internationally? I think that's a critical question. The other thing is, what is your view about Russia and China? Because, of course, in the United States, there's a campaign against Russia and China, the war in Ukraine, which was provoked by the United States, and encirclement of China. Is there a movement in your country to oppose all imperialist war? And what views do you have about that? Lastly, I mean, in the big political vacuum that exists internationally is that there's no working class parties, mass democratic working class parties, particularly in the United States, that can challenge both the Democrats and Republicans. So what is your view towards a formation of a working class party, democratic working class party that has a socialist program, and how it would be organized, how it should come about? And I think the other thing is, I think you should come to the United States. I invite you to come to San Francisco to speak to Americans, because I think Americans have to hear directly anti-imperialist viewpoints, working class viewpoints here in the United States, so they can see that there is an avenue for taking up a class perspective and a working class perspective towards this crisis.
Thank you, Steve. Dominic, you indicated you want to speak?
Well, it's John.
Or John, yeah.
Yeah. I'd like to thank Clare for her lead off, and particularly, in my mind, the clarification on people before profits. I have friends in Derry, and they support people before profits, because I think the only alternative that they see, and one that they totally reject, is Sinn Féin, because they see Sinn Féin as just a narrow nationalist Catholic party, not interested in, if you like, Irish unity in the sense of having united Catholic and Protestant, together. And as far as I can see it, there is that sort of superior attitude among certain lefts of looking down on working class people who voice grievances. And I think that is throughout Europe. I heard a commentary from France about the rise of the, what do you call it, the Front National. And this guy was speaking from somewhere in sort of rural France. And what he said was that people aren't particularly interested in the policies of the Front National. What really drives them is the fact that they have been forgotten, neglected, and if you like, their area has gone downhill. And I think the same sort of thing has happened in Britain, that the old industrial areas, like the Midlands and the North and the Northeast, you know, where there was plenty work, plenty factories, and working class people could make a decent living, that they've all been neglected. And unless you've got a university degree, you know, you're sort of on a sort of scrap heap of poor jobs and poor wages. So from that point of view, I'd just like to thank you for that, if you like, reasoning around the people before profits, because I'd always thought of them as being what their name is on, what the name's on the tin. You know, that they were an anti-capitalist party interested in people before profits. So I'll leave it at that. And thanks again.
Thank you, John. I know you said, Claire, you might want to leave earlier. Do you want to answer these points now, or do you want to wait a little bit longer?
It's really 5:15, but no, I'm grand, but I can answer these ones now, or I'll try at least. Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up people. I do it in reverse order. People before profit in Derry, because we had Bernadette Devlin McCalliskey out with us campaigning down in the south, the great leader of the civil rights movement and a close ally. Weird. Is that me? I hope not. Anyway, a close ally of people before profit in Derry. And I think, you know, a lot of people were disappointed, but many people weren't surprised, because that type of left sectarianism, putting the interests of your party or the perceived interest of your party ahead of the movement, has been quite their hallmark, to be honest. They didn't, in some ways it would suit them to have nobody in that position rather than somebody who's an independent left, because if you're an independent left who can articulate a class anti-imperialist position, well, why does anybody have to join people before profit? So they actually didn't care if the seat was lost to the movement or to Europe, as long as they had a chance of getting with it. But I think your points about the rise of the far right and the neglect of working class communities and so on are absolutely true. And unfortunately, the response of the left, and people before profit included, has been precisely to talk down to communities, to focus more so on issues of gender and identity and so on, rather than the sort of old bread and butter economic issues. And the far right, or whatever you want to call them, play on that. They're sort of saying that these people are, you know, they're more interested in that kind of thing than they are interested in the fact that you can't go to see a doctor or put food on the table. And unfortunately, the left give a lot of that credibility. I think in terms of the broader issues, you're absolutely right. In terms of support in the US, we have enormous support in the US. Has been crazy, from Hollywood A-listers to academics to just ordinary Americans. The yearning for something different and for a third way up against Tweedledum and Tweedledee is definitely really, really heartfelt. And, you know, I've been to the US before. I'm happy to go there again, maybe a little bit quick at the moment. Can't necessarily do it in the next month or two, but generally open to that idea. I think we're at a very important world juncture, which we talk about fascism or talk about militarism or whatever. But I do think that the war on Gaza and what Israel is getting away with is very much a litmus test to the world order as we knew it, kind of post World War II, even post the Cold War, because these norms of behavior of international law, which were only ever really for the other countries. They were never for empire, really. But they did bring a certain order, and now they're being bonfired publicly. It's not that there haven't been other genocides or terrible things happening before, but the fact of what's happening on Gaza is happening in full public view. And the majority of countries in the world and the highest legal authorities in the world and the majority of people in the countries that are supporting Israel are saying enough. And it seems powerless to change it. And that is having an effect, because this is the trial of a new world order where might is right becomes the new normal again. It was always the normal in history, but now to be the open normal. And that obviously is sort of goes side by side with any types of fascist administration and so on. But I do think those points are important. I think the game Europe is playing is incredibly dangerous, because they have, at the behest of the arms industry and at the expense of their own cost of living and energy, so they went along and played the game in provoking Russia, which unfortunately Russia responded to the provocation. That was their fault. They take responsibility. But the NATO provocation and the amount of money that has been won in that war for the military-industrial complex, but the dangerous juncture it's brought us to, even now, as it still goes on, the possibility of nuclear weapons being used, of a third world war, and not content with that now, they're already ratcheting it up against China. And while we might always, and it's just very, very dangerous. I don't believe that, I'm not a Chinese supporter or whatever, but I mean, nobody has played the destructive role that US empire has played. And I think the Chinese, and actually, the US and Europe thought they were building a wall around Russia and China, but actually they've just succeeded in building a wall around themselves. And the real world operates outside of the global north now, where the majority of the world's populations live. And I think in many ways that is the future through alternative arrangements. I don't have any illusions in it, but I do think it's a serious challenge to US empire. And that brings its own dangers. I mean, in terms of how do you build a movement in the US to fight fascism, or across Europe, a genuine working class party in the US, well, that's been the work of decades, and it takes greater brains than me in the very short time that we have to answer that. But in any area, how do you change anything? Well, you have to dig where you stand. So wherever you are and whatever arena you're in, be it a workplace, a community, a parliament, a council, a transnational parliament, you use that platform to organise for the ideas of democratic socialism, and you do it by making a link to the conditions that people are in now. And there's no doubt about it, the inequality that we have now is on a catastrophic level beyond anything that we've seen before. So taking up those issues and taking it away from the far right who've moved into the vacuum is the only way really to do it. It's not easy, but there is a great willingness for that. I mean, there's much more talk now about fascism in Europe than there would have been even 5 years ago. But it's not the constructive type engagement about our real history. You see the centre right, who are just as far right in some ways, warning about the danger of the far right, but adopting all of their clothes and carrying out a lot of their policies. So it's not straightforward, but the old ways and the patient work really is the only way in which it can be done, I suppose. And we have the benefit of social media too, which is actually a help, I think, in things not being secret. We live in a much smaller world now than we did before. I don't believe that the young people in the countries of Africa or South America or anywhere else are going to buy domination by empire or the colonial powers of Europe anymore. So out of that, we have to take hope.
Harris, did you indicate you wanted to speak again?
No, I was applauding.
Oh, yes. Okay, so before Clare leaves, does anybody else want to raise questions specifically that Clare might be able to deal with?
Yeah, I have a question. What's your view about George Galloway and the Workers' Party in England?
Well, look, I mean, I know my staff tried to keep me well away from him before the election, and in the last few years, I've had links with Galloway. I mean, he's a little bit. I think he plays a good role. My staff would tell me, no, he's been tainted because he's too pro-Russian and perceived as pro-Russian. But look, I'm called pro-Russian. Now, he probably actually is pro-Russian. I mean, but I'm not. I'm just not anti-Russian. But yeah, I don't know. I think he's played a useful enough role. I think he's been good. I think his stuff on Russia, that has been pretty constructive, really. I mean, we don't have to agree with everything anybody says, but I think he's used his platform and alternative media outlets to provide a different view. It's not one that we have to agree with everything on, a different view to lots of people, lots of them, because of the platform that he has. So I actually think that all of those platforms are pretty useful, even if we don't agree with everything. They are reaching an audience now through some of those podcasts, the likes of the work that the likes of the Grey Zone do in the US. A lot of those podcasts, Katie Halper and Mate, all of those people, you don't have to agree with everything, but they do provide an alternative view. And I think Galloway does that as well. But as an organizer and as someone who gets his hands dirty, I don't think he does it enough, you know. I think the fact that he has won seats and lost them kind of shows it's a bit of a platform for George rather than digging roots, which I think you need to do as well.
Jimmy, you indicated you wanted to speak.
And I was just putting up a signal there that Dermot was trying to get through to you, so I yield to him.
Dermot, do you want to speak at this point, Dermot? Where is he? I don't see him on the screen.
He's
something
muted.
called IO877 waving at you, which is muted at the moment. Is that what you mean? Can you see him?
Well, if you're there, Dermot, just come in.
No, he's been there a bit. It's not
His microphone is off.
Yeah, it's IO87. I'm sorry, I don't know who it is, but you need to unmute IO877.
Oh yeah, I can see you now, Dermot. Yes, there you go. Yeah. You're muted now. Yeah, okay. Go ahead, Dermot. Can't hear you.
Can you unmute your other screen? You've got another screen open, Dermot. That might work. We've got like a telephone, which is on. I think it's on. Yeah, on mute. No. Right, don't know then.
You're not coming through, Dermot. I mean, there's no indication I've been muted on the screen, so there's something wrong with the microphone connection there.
It's got two screens open, Finn. There's something at the bottom with just the telephone showing, and it's the same person. But that's on mute. Can you see it? The grey telephone.
I can see that. Oh, yeah.
Very, very quickly. Are you at the mobile? Yeah. You just tell Dermot that he's muted. If he wants to speak, he has to unmute himself.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's on his phone. He needs to unmute himself on his phone. You got that, Dermot?
No, we can't hear you, Dermot, unfortunately. There's another comment. Graham, do you want to speak at this point? We'll come back to you, Dermot. Graham.
Just on Claire's, couple of things Claire's just recently said, which worry me a bit. During her main contribution, she talked about people before profit not focusing on bread and butter issues and focusing on too many issues like gender. That sort of talk always worries me because it probably means that we are prepared to make concessions to the backward consciousness of elements of the class. I wasn't going to comment on that. That is, you know, in the militant tradition. I understand the grant-eyed tradition, but when we talk about Galloway and say he's made a good contribution, you don't have to agree with everything. I think we have to be clear. We have to be very clear about the Workers' Party under Galloway. It's a one-man show in which Galloway has been widely criticised, quite rightly, for his consistent peddling of homophobic ideas, his consistent playing to the so-called normal family of a man, a woman, and ex-children He's got 6 children. They don't get this nasty sex education where you can learn about lesbian rights and gay rights. And that is such an offensive and homophobic stance that a lot of people, myself included, have completely distanced ourselves from Galloway and his party on that issue, because recognizing the rights, it doesn't need saying, surely, recognizing the rights of other people's sexuality is not a contentious issue for the workers' movement. It's been a position of our movement for 40, 50 years now, quite rightly. Many of us have been in the forefront of that fight. To have anything to do with Galloway and is playing to a reactionary Muslim vote is absolutely unacceptable in my view. Not to mention, but I will mention it, at his launch of the election manifesto of his Workers' Party, he made the extraordinary comment that what Britain now needs is another Winston Churchill. He wants another imperialist murderer to lead the British. And so we have to be clear about this. He's not the answer. He can't be the answer. He's deeply reactionary and inconsistent. And I'm surprised to hear Clare feeling differently about it, but I understand. I find it quite hard to follow the subtleties of Dublin politics, and that just may be a mistake. I don't know what Clare says about that.
Thank you, Graham. You might want to comment before you leave there, Clare, on that question.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't think it's a ringing endorsement of George Galloway. I know very little about him, and if it came across as that, I certainly didn't mean it as so. Or his Workers' Party, which I didn't mention because I don't know anything about it. My knowledge of him really is through his bits and pieces on Russia Today, on the war in Ukraine and so on, which was grand, a bit pro-Russian, as I said, but open out that audience. As for his other views, well, as I say, I don't follow him, so obviously they are not my views and I don't condone them. And if that's the way he conducts his Workers' Party, well then, yeah. Obviously, that's nothing got to do with me. So you've clarified it. You know a lot more about him than me. But yeah, it is a case. He's a politician in a different country. I don't know a whole lot about him. That was my sort of gut reaction to him. In terms of the broader issues, though, in terms of my point on gender and stuff, and again, I'd be a little bit concerned now because anybody who knows me knows that I raised and continue to raise all issues in terms of homosexuality, women's rights, abortion, all of these issues when it wasn't easy to do so, when it was difficult to do them in Ireland. What's happened now is that it's very easy to raise these issues. The only issues that are platformed that if you want to get your name in the paper about and you come from the left is to highlight these issues. And then the media will closet you in their open arms and tell you you're great and you're wonderful. And that's what we see in a lot of the social democratic and liberal groups in the European Parliament, is that they embrace and discuss for endless hours on end these issues and get applauded by the media for them. So I have no problem. My position on all of those issues has been, as it always has been, but it is a simple fact that left-wing groups in Ireland have spent far more time on these issues than they have had on organising in working-class communities on economic and bread and butter issues. And I'm sorry, but my position is that that is a mistake by the left. And I think in an Irish context, and from what I've seen in some of the countries in Europe as well, it's done to curry favour with the mainstream media, to get yourself a bit of publicity, to put yourself like a little bit beyond the social democratic left, to get the applause of maybe some of the NGOs and so on. And that's just a fact, but it's meant in no way to denigrate the importance of those issues, which I've championed all my political life, including trans issues in the Irish Parliament. I'm not saying they're not important, but it's definitely a problem, in my opinion, on the way in which the left has behaved.
Thank you, Clare. Dermot, are you getting any success coming through there?
He's still not unmuted his phone. He's unmuted his picture, but he's not his phone. Dermot, if you're using a phone as well, you need to unmute yourself on your phone.
Well, okay. Well, the meeting will be continuing. Clare, how are you fixed with time now?
5 minutes. Jimmy had wanted to come in there. You bypassed
Jimmy,
him.
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
Jimmy.
Okay, what I wanted to come in with was, it's more or less been covered, but I just want to identify it particularly in relation to left sectarianism. Left sectarianism was a positive, that's the wrong word to use, was a definite feature in the elections, in both the Euro elections in Ireland and in the local elections. And to give an example of it, one of the leading trade union activists, a chap called Brendan Ogle of Unite, who was at the front of most of the major campaigns on social charges, water charges, in charge, whatever. It not only stood as a candidate, an independent candidate in the elections, but in his propaganda which he issued, specifically named and identified Clare as a Russian, a Putinist agent. I mean, it was unbelievable stuff. It was the type of stuff you would expect from the far right. Certainly not from an individual who was representing the left in the Labour movement. The second thing to indicate the nature of the attacks, which affected all the real left comrades, was during the early stages of the election campaign, People Before Profit had a televised show, which was a televised news item, which was transmitted nationally. And in that, they called for, remember in Ireland, election is by proportional representation, where you can transfer your votes accordingly as your preferences are eliminated. And what happened was they proposed that their transfers should go to Sinn Féin, the same Sinn Féin that the Labour movement has been looking at as parasitic opportunists and careerists. I mean, it's so inconsistent. I can give a personal comment on People Before Profit. There are many, many individuals at People Before Profit who are good people. They're good socialist consciousness, but they've been led by careerists. They're led by opportunists. And they have a tradition of being in the front rows of any major activity, any marches, any demonstrations, any campaigns. They're in the front rows with Sinn Féin doing the exact same thing. When most of the people in the marches, in the demonstrations, are trade unionists or young people drawn to ideas, drawn to activities that they hope will produce change. I'll just leave it at that. And maybe Joan might come in, because she also, in her constituency, was subject to the same attacks and the same personalised attacks. And it's interesting that the lad who is the comrade who won the seat in her constituency, not only won the seat, but actually headed the poll, which in a constituency where the betrayal and opportunism of People Before Profit was rampant as well. Maybe I'd ask Joan to fill in on that as well, please.
Speak now, Joan.
Okay. I think Dermot can come in there now, but anyway, listen, I know Claire has to go. Maybe one question I want to ask you from the international perspective is, what do you think a Trump-Vance win is going to mean for NATO, and Trump's stance on NATO? Will it just cause more chaos, or will it put a kibosh into the NATO agenda for a period of time? I don't know whether you want me to report on what happened in the elections here in the south, or whether just to come in on the left sectarianism, or.
Yeah, I understand, Joan. Claire has to leave shortly, so maybe Claire might deal with that question you've asked.
Back in, yeah, I'll just go back
about France and NATO, and then you can go down, Claire, if you wish.
Yeah.
No, and thanks, and I totally agree with the points that Jimmy made there as well. Yeah, well, it'd be very interesting to see what happens. I mean, I suppose, yeah, I mean, I can't call it will be a help, because the thought of Trump being re-elected is appalling. Like, it's such a Hobson's choice of awfulness, like, but I suppose is is Trump going to be less destructive on the international stage? Is he going to maybe annoy some of those very strong militaristic vested interests, be they NATO or otherwise? Well, more than the Democrats would, yeah. But I mean, overall, he's going to be, as he was the last time, I suppose. It's not a gain. It'll be, we can't use the word a help in terms of the war in Ukraine, but it's not a help. But well, he might be less bad on that one, but overall, yeah. I mean, I suppose it's not going to be a killer blow, but I think there will be strains and there will be a new dynamic. I suppose is the best way. It's the best way of putting it. A new dynamic in the relationship between NATO and themselves. It'll be more difficult, but they are very well connected everywhere and they'll soldier on, and they have their big arms companies and their lobbies, and Ireland's involvement in NATO is now practically everything except name at this stage.
Yeah.
They're here to stay. And sometimes it's choreography rather than content, and they just come and have their influence in a different way. But I think he'll be a little bit problematic for some of the vested interests that are out there, but only because he favours other vested interests and other projects. So it's a kind of a Hobson's choice, you know.
Yeah.
Thank you, Clare. Well, before you leave, on behalf of the comrades here, I want to thank you very much for a very illuminating and very informative contribution to this discussion. You opened loads of questions for further consideration, and it's a very positive approach which you take to all of the questions which have come up, some of them quite complicated and intricate. So it's only a basis for further discussion. But I want to thank you again for the contribution. It's a very, very valuable contribution.
Thanks very much, and thanks to everyone.
See you again, Clare. We hope to see you again at meetings of this nature.
Thanks a million. Bye-bye.
Thank you. So, before Joan comes in, I see Steve had indicated earlier that you wanted to talk again.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the points kind of been covered already a little bit, but I just want to reiterate about the role Galloway is playing. He's played a completely destructive role in building any kind of working class party in Britain. The lash up that he's put together in the Workers' Party of Britain, including people like Monty Panesar, ex-UKIP people, and basically people from the far right, not to mention his complete at face value attempt to construct some sort of a working relationship with Nigel Farage. Then he goes and attacks the Albanians, and then he makes dog whistle noises about illegal aliens landing on the south coast, while simultaneously praising the Bengali community. Look, this is not now just a renegade on the left. This is a complete populist who will say absolutely anything to get elected. He's got no place on the left. He's pursuing the agenda of the Iranian and the Russian ruling classes. And for those people who still think that the Soviet Union is still in existence, it ended 30 years ago. You know, there is no socialism left in the oligarchs of Putin and the people who rule Russia. So Galloway, while he might be, some sort of anti-imperialist, and that is to be recognised, his role in building a working class party in Britain has been absolutely destructive. And he's actually, he's recruiting people like him, complete demagogues, complete narcissists, even as far as I've seen them. And I think that, obviously we don't know all the peculiarities of people in different countries, and people can make mistakes about that. But I'm going to put it on record exactly what I think about George Galloway. He's an obstruction to building any working class movement. He's not an asset.
Thank you, Steve. Joan, do you want to speak at this point now?
And do you want me to make a contribution or just to?
Yes, you can speak of any issues that you think will help to illuminate the discussions we've been having.
Yeah, well, maybe just to hone in a little bit on the local and Euros here. I mean, I know Clare made the general international points in Europe, but there was a collapse of the Sinn Féin vote in both the locals and the Euros. I think there were 14% in the locals and 12% in the Euros. And that was from a 37% polling only 18 months ago. The sort of populist true sense of, you know, all things to all people, the general support that was based on sort of a coalition of nationalists, a lot of working class people were abandoned by Labour in 2011 and 2016 when they went into government, and they particularly attracted young and progressives on housing issues and that as well. But they seem to have lost support to both right and left and the centre to a certain degree. The growth of anti-refugee sentiments and the turn to the right and preparedness to be in government had a big impact on their vote. The Sinn Féin also were also impacted by the lower vote in the locals, 40% turnout, lowest among working class young people. In the general election, I think that would go up higher, possibly to 6%. So Sinn Féin would probably be around 20%, but it certainly won't be at the level that they thought they would be, and their preparedness for the local elections was based on that 37% vote that they thought they had. Just to say that, just to let people know that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael did not win in the local elections. In 2014, Fianna Fáil had 267 seats in the locals, that's nationally, and Fine Gael had 235%. In 2019, they had 279 seats and 255. And in this year, they got 248 seats. Fianna Fáil did, and Fine Gael got 245 seats, nearly half the seats in the local councils. But they certainly didn't gain. They actually went down. But they held their own against perspective that they would lose seats. There was an expectation that they would do badly in the elections. And Fine Gael, I think, got a small bounce with the new leader there, Harris. It's now likely on that basis, if something drastically doesn't change in favour of Sinn Féin, that they will form the next government, possibly with independence and probably on right-wing independence to a certain degree. I don't think they would be. They would certainly do that deal before they'd go in with Sinn Féin. The left, and you put maybe Labour, I don't know whether you should put them into that because of their position. The Social Democrats, who are a new phenomenon, people for profit and ourselves, got about 12% of the votes, so there's no real change there. The far right, you know, we're looking at, as has been said earlier on, right throughout Europe, the US, the UK, France, Italy, Germany, Sweden, the growth of the far right parties. Similar attitudes on immigration are here, the threat to culture. It's around 20%. If you look at the situation that's developed in Coolock, which is a big working class area of Dublin over the last week or so, but it has been festering for the last 3 or 4 months, where a paint factory that had been sold, obviously, was being prepared to be used for international protection migrants, and the community, along with being driven more so by the far right, are opposing it. And you know, I was talking to a woman I know from the Water Charges campaign, Caught Inglis, who's quite, you know, class conscious, who has said that what the government and the government party said to them in their communities was that if they accepted the Crown, this building, to be used for international protection, for 500 international protection asylum seekers, that they would give money for playgrounds, for, you know, certain amount of monies all around the place that they were looking for, but only on the basis that they would accept the building being used for asylum seekers. So they feel they've been blackmailed into accepting things as well. And as the point been made, that these are working class communities that have been deprived of public services since the austerity years in 2009, 10, 11, 12, have seen devastated in the drugs task forces and all that would have been on the ground supporting people in relation to a crisis in the drug taken in that. So in relation to just that far right vote, it's not a surprise. The attitudes exist here, as all over the world. There's we've always had the anti-traveller sentiment here in Ireland, and until fairly recently, it's now in the background. The influx of refugees, Ukrainians and others, topped by the housing crisis, decades of underfunding of public services. It's just like, you know, everything has just come together in a really bad situation. And I also make the point about the failure of the left. Since 2011, when we had the opportunity for the United Left alliance, and that was squandered. And I think if we had been able to manage to pull that together and maintain it, we would have been in a much better position now than we find ourselves from the point of view of representing our own class. The difference here at the moment, the key one of the main differences is that we have no figure. There's no actual figure like a Farage figure or a Trump figure or a Le Pen figure or a Maloney figure or whatever. They're generally very disparate at the moment, but they will learn from Europe and from what's happening around the world. Sinn Féin were blocked to that development up to now, but I think that because they were saying, and I just want to make a few points, that the anti-immigrant sentiment seems to be directed towards Sinn Féin, and that's been sort of propagated by the media, by the government. They're seen as the problem. They are also seen as being part more of government. They were that radical change voice of, say, 2 years ago. They're seen more as being part of the government. They supported 2 referendums recently in March that the government put forward, and that was overwhelmingly defeated nationally, those 2 referendums. And also their position in housing hasn't been been pushed into the background the last year and a half, 2 years. And also their hardcore, I was talking to a few of long-term Sinn Féin supporters going back years who were very, very critical of Sinn Féin moving to that position of being prepared for government. From talking to multinationals, corporations over in America and all that, preparing themselves, we're okay, we're not going to cause any problems here. And they're seen more as just being another, you know, potential no change government if they got into power. But the far right, I think we shouldn't underestimate them, but we shouldn't overestimate them at the moment neither. And I think it's going to be a difficult general election coming up now. It's either going to be in February next year, it has to take place, or it could go in November. And there is a problem with the left from that point of view. Just to make a point about, Jimmy said about left sectarianism, and I really don't want to concentrate on it because I think we have to, from my point of view, we have to be able to expose what the establishment parties have been implementing for the last 30, 40 years, that neoliberal agenda, that has left many communities absolutely deprived of services. Is that Breed Smith, I would have been one of the founders of People for Profit going back a number of years, because I felt that it was that with the SWP, because I thought it would have been a movement that could have developed into a change. I said People for Profit, someone mentioned earlier on. But it quickly became very clear that that wasn't going to be the case, because the SWP, Socialist Workers' Party, just took it over from the point of view of all the directions came from the centre into the branches, and then the branches were to respond to that. And Breed Smith, I won the seat in 2011, the seat in the Dail. And in 2016, Breed Smith stood not against me, but she stood with the People for Profit. And what had happened beforehand, the basis was laid to undermine me completely, saying that I was not a revolutionary socialist, that I was, you know, bordering, some of my positions were not working class, not representing working class people, and they got this around the area, and that gave her the base to stand. And we did take the seat, 2 seats on the left that time. And in relation to the European election, I thought it was absolutely reprehensible, the SWP, People for Profit, standing in the Dublin and Leinster area, because Bree Smith, when she was being interviewed, and they asked her particularly about that Clare could lose her seat on the basis of her standing. She said then that there was 2 left seats to be taken in the European elections, and if not, sure, that's politics anyway. You know, no understanding of the class nature of what they're supposed to be doing, representing the working class, support and the working class movement. It was just purely sectarianism to try and see could they take a seat. And we're going to be seeing this in the general election as well, I think, this thing about transfers and all that type of stuff, and having a transfer pact, which I think the left should have, but it's very difficult to see how that can develop from the point of view of the role People for Profit played up to now. But that's that's maybe a few of the points to raise as part of the discussion, if that makes an awful lot of sense to people that are probably internationally don't really understand the minutiae of Irish politics. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Thank you, Joan. Before we continue, just want to come back to a point that Steve Zeltser raised earlier about the need for a united front against fascism.
Yeah.
No, there are fascist forces in Ireland. There's no question whatever about it. There's an openly fascist organisation, and there's several organisations on the fringe of fascism. So under certain conditions, fascism could become a real force in Irish society. There's a lot of violence against immigrants. The guy was attacked down in Limerick. Asylum seekers have been camping on the banks of the Grand Canal because they can't get accommodation. They've been attacked. People have marched down to certain areas with pieces of lead piping and hurleys with a view to attacking these migrants, and some of them have had their tents shredded and the tents thrown into the canal. There's been demonstrations, not just in North Dublin, Coolock, a place where I know quite well. Big demonstrations there, mainly ordinary people, but the right-wing leaders, some of them openly fascist, some of them kind of quasi-extreme right-wing people, going up there, addressing meetings with an anti-immigrant slant. So there is a real danger, and it's other parts of the country as well. In addition to these groups, there's also rural right-wing groups forming as well around a set of right-wing ideas. So that point by Steve is important. We need to have a united front against fascism, and the united front would consist of the trade union movement, community groups, left-wing political parties, and other groups. And there have been attempts to do that. There was a group called Lekela, which is an Irish version of the word together. That was quite effective, quite big demonstrations, and they brought together community groups, trade unions. That needs to reform. So it's an important point you've raised there, Steve. Even though we don't at the moment have fascism, we're not on the verge of a fascist takeover, but we do know at this point, we do at this stage need to organise to defeat fascism and its emergence in countries such as Ireland. I'm not familiar sufficiently with what's happening in England, but in Europe, places like Greece and the Nordic countries, there are again openly fascist organisations organising. So it's a good point, and these maybe need to dwell on it. I know we've problems with on the left with the need to unite the left, but the way to fight the fascists or the potentially fascist or growth of fascist organisations requires and necessitates unity on the left. So it's not just about competition in elections, it's about defeating the emergence of right-wing forces. So I wanted to come back to that because it might need a bit more attention as to how this is going to be achieved in Europe. Who else wants to speak at this point? Harris, you're indicating again, or are you waving?
No, I'm indicating that I want to speak. It's
Yeah.
more of a comment than a question, but it's exactly on this question of fighting fascism. I always thought that perhaps Marx only said 3 important or 4 important words, which was "workers of the world unite." Maybe it's 5 words. And the most important word maybe over there, which was perhaps the most revolutionary, was unite, was the word unite. And it seems that we're still not ready. And despite technological innovations which have all brought us together, we're still not ready. We're still not ready to overcome, to be true internationalists, or to find the right mode of sort of globalism, I think it's called, like, mixing the global without threatening the local. And this is what seems to be coming back with a vengeance to bite us now. Like, that Europe as a whole was a project which was led at the end of the 1940s by France and Germany, burying the hatchet after 1,000 years of war, basically, when they were both destroyed. And they decided to join their hands and start the European Union, maybe for their own reasons or whatever. Or maybe it was the imperialists in this country or whatever. But I think the fact that not even in their education, the fact that we've got neo-fascism, we've got fascism now, it means that the education, that, that there are people convinced by these arguments of race, identity, I want my local, people who don't have the same skin color are not good. And you see it even in the European Parliament. You get the fascists, they don't agree between themselves because one person's fascist is another person's hero. Yet the left has not managed to defeat that. And I find that we're not perhaps even ready for Marx's, these 5 words, basically, which you can just keep these 5 words and throw away the rest of the garbage or whatever he wrote, like all the volumes or whatever, like, the 70 volumes or all that work. I don't know if, most probably you've heard all of this before, and it's much very simple thing that I'm saying. But I really think that that little slogan is very, very fruitful and has not yet been implemented. Maybe because the Russians were also, like, didn't follow Trotsky, or, they just went and shot an axe through his head. They weren't ready either, perhaps, for that. But maybe it's time, with the new technology, to try and focus on that. And it can, of course there's threats, because we all follow Taylor Swift, for example. That might be a way out. We might follow it. It doesn't have to be Taylor Swift. Tomorrow it might be the Chinese Taylor Swift or K-pop or whatever. But these might be efforts worth following to try to find this globalism, like, rather than retreat into the identity politics and the fascism. I find it incredible how education hasn't managed to do that, how state education hasn't managed to do that. It's the biggest failure, according to me. They started that, they buried the hatchet, and then 70 years later, we've got fascism back. So either people were never convinced by the European project, or there's something seriously wrong going on with that project. And I'll stop there because I know I'm rambling.
Okay, comrade, we need to be drawing the discussion towards a conclusion. So if anybody else wishes to speak, they're free to do so in the amount of time that's remaining to us here. So if anybody else wishes to speak, just indicate. Otherwise, we'll draw the discussion towards a conclusion.
Just to say, somebody put up a question there, did Bernadette McAlliskey campaign against Clare? No, she didn't. She was supporting Clare's campaign.
Oh, yes, that's right. Well, before we ask Roger to speak about next week's meeting then, I think this was a very good meeting, not because it resolved issues, although some issues were clarified, but because it has raised questions of an urgent nature that we all need to spend time looking at. like the way our meeting began, it was a loss to the international left socialist movement that Clare Daly lost her seat in the European Parliament. You would have heard about her impact in several countries. That's a major loss. There's a number of reasons for that, which we've gone into here, but it has to be recognised as a major loss to the socialist movement. There's also been questions raised about the need to build the left. It's not just about competing, but building the left, and there has to be left unity. Now, what happened in France was a short-term measure to defeat Le Pen in the parliamentary elections, but we need longer-term measures to build a serious left, not just between left-wing parties, self-described left-wing parties, but the left involving the trade union movement, the mass movement of workers as they're organised in the trade unions. They need to be part of this process as well. When we're competing with the traditional socialist parties, sometimes everybody feels a sense of relief that they're being defeated. We need to be careful that we're building something which is, we're building an alternative mass movement of workers. So we're not celebrating the defeat of the socialist international across Europe as an issue on its own. We want to have an alternative mass socialist party based on working class organizations as the only alternative to the failed policies of reformism and social democracy in the past. So there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of issues to be looked at. And I think this discussion has been very useful and very helpful in our consideration of these questions for the future. So I want to thank the comrades that spoke.
Sorry to interrupt you, Finn, but Cliff's wants to say something. I don't know if you still do. He didn't know how to raise his hand.
Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. I didn't see any other hands up.
Yes, well, sorry. I'll commit to becoming a little more technically savvy. Maybe
I'm sorry, Cliff, I didn't see your hand there. Go ahead.
Well, you didn't see it because I was unable to raise it electronically here, and so it's no fault of yours. But I did want to thank, for Jimmy, who I was able to see in Dublin not too long ago. I brought my family there to invite me to the meeting, and for Joan and Claire to hear you all speaking. It's been a long time since I've sat in one of your meetings and something like this, but I just did want to at least underline how starkly I felt the parallels were between the situation in the United States with the general retreat of the left and the opportunist exploitation of that retreat by the right. I'm kind of stunned that it's happening in such concentric circles within the EU and around the world here. But in any case, I just wanted to say hi, and I think that Steve had raised the issue of bringing Clare to the U.S. for some few speaking engagements, which I think would be extremely helpful, just in terms of giving U.S. workers some viable voice or idea to rally around. I know that Clare, anytime you saw her on video, would inspire that kind of dedication for her unapologetic statements against the state of Israel, and was such an alternative and inspiring on that basis. But to even get such a meeting together in the U.S. would invite a cascade of opposition, especially during an election year where the Democrats are so insecure and so weak, and watching, the whole nation is watching them fall apart before our very eyes, that they're going to be extremely defensive to anybody who represents any kind of challenge or alternative to that. So I think that we'd have to be thoughtful about how we would pursue that. But in any case, I just wanted to say hello to everybody and give a bit of a thanks.
Thank you, Cliff. Roger, do you want to say something about our next WIN meeting?
Yes, thanks, comrade. Right, well, the simple answer to that first question is we're not having a meeting next week because we're taking our, I think, deserved summer break. We're not having any meetings until early September when we'll resume. But I'd like to say a few points just before the meeting closes. I do think, and I hope that comrades would agree, there is no other forum where it's possible to have discussions of this nature, of the kind that WIN offers, where we have a free, open discussion of comrades, whatever their background and their point of view, as long as they're activists within the working class movement. And we've had comrades from actually over the nearly 5 years that Win has been organising these Zoom meetings. I think we've had comrades from about 40 countries who participated and given first-hand, on-the-spot, eyewitness accounts of struggles that have been taking place right on their streets or on their doorsteps. Just in the last couple of months alone, just going from memory, we've had discussions and first-hand reports from comrades involved in struggles as today in Ireland and the EU, in France, in India, in Iran, in Sri Lanka, in Namibia, in Chile. We've had meetings of in memory of the miners' strike from a veteran militant of that strike. That's just in the last couple of months. So with the 5 years, as I say, we've covered a huge spectrum. And we want to, the one criticism that I would have, or the one failing of Win, is that we should be reaching a lot more people than we are. And we want to try to do something to promote Win a little more and to involve more comrades, despite the fact that, of course, it's inconvenient at a weekend. We have to take into account the fact, when we fix the timing of the meetings, that we cover something like 16 time zones. We've had comrades here today, for instance, from California, and from California in the west to India in the east, and so on. Now, I'd like to remind comrades also that as well as our meetings, we also have a Win website, a Win Facebook page, a Win YouTube channel. It's quite easy to just look at our archive of meetings, and to if you wanted to follow up anything you missed, just watch the YouTube video recording of the meetings. So look, we will be back very much so in early September, and I hope that all of the comrades will keep us in mind, will participate, and perhaps recommend to their contacts in their own countries and internationally that this is the arena, this is the forum in which you can exchange ideas in a free and democratic discussion and really keep a finger on the pulse of working class struggles the world over. Thanks, comrades.
Thank you, Roger. Jimmy, you want to say something there? You're muted, Jimmy.
We've spoken about the meetings that we've had and the visitors who we were honoured to have speak to us. We've spoken about some of the disasters and some of the gains. But there's one group of workers that we treasured meeting with them, and that's a group of trade unionists from Belarus, members of the REP trade union, the Electoral Workers Trade Union. They're now in their third year of imprisonment, and it's an imprisonment of total isolation in most cases. Those comrades spoke on these screens. They asked us for help. We tried to help. We managed to achieve help with them. Some of the monies, the materials that they received came through comrades on these screens. Also, they got political support in the personal efforts of both Joan and Clare. Their incarcerations, which is a criminal act, were raised in the Irish Dáil by Joan and in Europe by Clare. But I would ask comrades here, over the month that we're silent, that in that silent month, we remember those comrades in the jails in Belarus. And when September comes back, we would have achieved the target that at least every one of us present would have familiarized themselves with the problems and concerns of the REP trade unionists and their families, and will have raised it in at least one trade union. That's an appeal I'm making. Just raise their trials in one union and try and seek the support. in both political and trade union efforts to get them freed. That's all I want to say.
Thank you, Jimmy, for bringing that to the attention of the attendees here. So with that, we'll conclude the discussion tonight. So thank you all for your attendance and enjoy the remainder of the summer. So, okay, comrades.